They say I go by Manly Desert, but that doesn't matter. This is my downfall.
This is the downfall of a man who thought he was untouchable, a Manchester gangster who built an empire on encrypted phones, international drug routes, and a belief that the law would never catch him. This is the true crime documentary of Craig McKenzie, known to his criminal associates as Manly Desert, and to the streets as Teflon. Craig McKenzie's story begins not in the boardrooms of legitimate business, but in the shadows of Greater Manchester's underworld. Born in the early 80s, McKenzie's criminal career started shockingly early. At just 13 years old in 1996, he earned his first conviction for robbery. Think about that for a moment. 13, an age when most children are worried about school exams and football practice. But Craig McKenzie was already being processed through the criminal justice system. That first conviction was just the beginning. Over the following decades, McKenzie would rack up 18 separate convictions, spanning 26 offences. He became well known to police across the northwest of England. But here's what made Craig McKenzie different from your average repeat offender. He didn't just accept his criminal identity, he embraced it. He celebrated it. He even named one of his property businesses Teflon Holdings. Teflon, the non-stick coating, because Craig McKenzie genuinely believed that no charges, no matter how serious, would ever stick to him. And for a long time, he seemed to be right. In 2009, a man named Amran Khan, known as Manny, was shot dead on his doorstep in Oldham. The killing was allegedly over an unpaid £12,000 heroin debt. Two men, identical twin brothers, carried out the shooting. They're now serving life sentences, but the man accused of plotting the murder, of pulling the strings behind the scenes, was Craig McKenzie. The trial came in 2011. McKenzie stood in the dock at Manchester Crown Court and denied everything. He told the jury he had nothing to do with drugs. He claimed he was just a car dealer, a legitimate businessman, and remarkably, the jury believed him. By a majority of 10-2, they acquitted Craig McKenzie of murder. He walked free, and that's when the nickname truly stuck. Teflon, nothing could touch him. But acquittal doesn't mean innocence. It just means the prosecution couldn't prove their case beyond reasonable doubt, and Craig McKenzie knew it. He'd beaten a murder charge. He'd convinced 12 people that he was innocent. It gave him something dangerous, confidence, arrogance even, the belief that he could operate with impunity. By the late 2010s, McKenzie had built himself a life that looked, from the outside, almost legitimate. He lived in a nice house in Cheadle-Hulme, an affluent suburb of Greater Manchester. He drove luxury cars. He wore designer clothes. He even had that property business, Teflon Holdings, to explain where his money came from. To any neighbour glancing over the fence, Craig McKenzie might have looked like a successful property developer, a bit flash perhaps, but successful. The reality was very different. Craig McKenzie wasn't making his money from property. He was making it from drugs, huge quantities of drugs, cocaine from the Netherlands and Spain, heroin from multiple international sources, cannabis shipped in from North America, and he was coordinating all of it using an encrypted communications platform called Encrochat. Encrochat was, for a time, the drug dealer's best friend. It was a modified phone network that promised total anonymity. Criminals across Europe used it to coordinate shipments, arrange murders, plan robberies. The phones cost thousands of pounds and came with military-grade encryption. Messages would auto-delete. Usernames were anonymous. On Encrochat, Craig McKenzie became Manly Desert, and Manly Desert thought he was invisible. By 2020, Craig McKenzie was running a sophisticated drug trafficking operation that stretched across continents. He had established relationships with prolific international criminals. These weren't street dealers. These were serious organized crime figures in Spain, the Netherlands, North America, even the United Arab Emirates, and they gave him access to other criminal conspiracies unfolding across the UK and overseas. McKenzie used runners to transport his drugs to customers. Most of his clients were based in Liverpool and Manchester, but his reach extended to Wales and down to London. The scale was staggering. Between March and June 2020 alone, McKenzie was coordinating the importation of 45 kilograms of cocaine and 14 kilograms of heroin. Together, those drugs had a street value of £5 million. He was also bringing in 90 kilograms of cannabis, worth another £900,000. And then there was the money, vast amounts of cash flowing from drug sales across the UK. During that same 3-month period in 2020, McKenzie laundered approximately £400,000. He sent money to notorious criminals in Spain and the United Arab Emirates through sophisticated money laundering channels. The cash moved through shell companies, fake invoices, property fronts. It was a well-oiled machine. McKenzie lived like a king. He wore a Richard Mille RM1103 rose gold titanium watch worth £250,000, £250,000, on his wrist. He drove a brand new BMW X5 and a Volkswagen Tiguan R-Line. His home was filled with designer goods, and yet, when investigators later looked at his finances, they discovered he'd declared an income of just £33,000 in 2021. £33,000. The watch alone was worth more than 7 years of his declared income. But Craig McKenzie wasn't working alone. This was a family business. His older brother Wayne, a former professional footballer, was his partner in the operation. In fact, when Wayne was committing these crimes in 2020, he was actually on license, released early from a previous drug trafficking conviction. He'd served time, got out, and immediately gone back to the same criminal enterprise. Wayne used the Encrochat handles, Little Orchid, and Radiant Acid, and his conversations on those encrypted phones revealed a man deeply embedded in the violence and chaos of the drug trade. In one particularly chilling exchange, Wayne discussed smuggling a gun inside a chemical waste shipment. He bragged that the last firearm he'd imported was sold straight to kids in London. Kids, that's the reality of organized crime. It doesn't stay contained to adult criminals in back rooms. It spills out onto the streets, into schools, into communities. Together, Craig and Wayne McKenzie ran a criminal empire. They imported drugs and guns. They laundered millions of pounds. They lived in luxury while communities across the UK suffered the consequences of their trade, and they believed they'd never be caught. If you're fascinated by UK true crime stories like this one, stories that expose the dark reality of organized crime in Britain, then hit that subscribe button now, because there's so much more to this story, and what happens next will shock you. For Craig McKenzie, 2020 should have been his golden year. Business was booming, the drugs were flowing, the money was rolling in. His Encrochat phone kept him connected to an international network of criminals, and the encryption kept him safe, or so he thought. What McKenzie didn't know was that French and Dutch law enforcement agencies had achieved something extraordinary. They'd managed to hack Encrochat, not just intercept messages, but actually penetrate the entire network. They'd installed a software update that gave them access to every message sent, every contact made, every criminal conspiracy discussed on the platform, and they shared that intelligence with law enforcement agencies across Europe, including the National Crime Agency in the UK. Operation Venetic was launched. It was the UK law enforcement response to the Encrochat breach, led by the National Crime Agency, and it would become one of the most successful operations against organised crime in British history. Thousands of arrests, tons of drugs seized, millions of pounds recovered, and Craig McKenzie, Manly Desert, was right in their crosshairs. But McKenzie had no idea. In March 2020, he was going about his business as usual. The messages flowed back and forth on his encrypted phone, arranging shipments, discussing prices, coordinating laundering operations. Between March and June 2020, NCA investigators would later count 11,043 messages linked to McKenzie's Manly Desert handle. 11,000 messages, each one a piece of evidence, each one building the case against him. McKenzie was discussing cocaine shipments from Spain. He was arranging cannabis imports from North America. He was coordinating with his brother Wayne on firearms smuggling. He was sending instructions to his runners about where to deliver drugs across the UK. And he was constantly talking about money, how much was coming in, where to send it, how to clean it. The property business, Teflon Holdings, was crucial to his money laundering operation. On paper, it looked legitimate, but investigators would later discover it was essentially a shell company, a front. Money would flow through it, seemingly from property transactions, but in reality from drug sales. Fake invoices would be created, false records maintained. It was sophisticated financial crime layered on top of drug trafficking, and McKenzie's lifestyle reflected his success. That £250,000 watch wasn't just for show, it was a status symbol in criminal circles. The same with the cars, the clothes, the cash in the house. Craig McKenzie wanted everyone to know he'd made it, that he was untouchable, that he was Teflon. His connections were impressive, at least from a criminal standpoint. Wayne McKenzie was handling his side of the operation. He oversaw the importation logistics, making sure shipments actually made it into the UK. He arranged distribution networks, ensuring drugs got from ports or airports to the streets, and he coordinated with money launderers overseas to wash the profits. Wayne's experience in organised crime, even his previous conviction, had taught him how the system worked, and he was using that knowledge to his advantage. By late 2021, the case was solid. The NCA had everything they needed. They had digital evidence of the drug conspiracies. They had proof of money laundering. They had identified the international connections. They'd traced the luxury assets, and they were ready to strike. NCA officers arrived at his house in Cheadle Hulme with arrest warrants and search authorization. This wasn't a speculative raid. This was a targeted operation. backed by months of intelligence and thousands of intercepted messages. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they knew exactly who Craig McKenzie was. Imagine the scene. McKenzie, who'd spent years believing he was untouchable, who'd beaten a murder charge, who'd built his entire identity around being Teflon, suddenly facing the reality that his encrypted communications weren't encrypted at all. Every message he'd sent thinking it was secure had been read by law enforcement. Every criminal conspiracy he'd discussed had been documented. Every piece of evidence he thought he'd hidden had been exposed. The officers tore his house apart, not destructively, but methodically, professionally. They knew what they were looking for, and they found it. £33,000 in cash, just sitting in the house. Designer goods and clothing worth £128,000. Not antiques or inherited jewelry. Designer goods, current season, expensive trainers, luxury brands. The physical manifestation of drug money. They seized his vehicles, the BMW X5, the Volkswagen Tiguan. Both nearly new, both expensive, both purchased with money that couldn't possibly have come from a property business earning £33,000 a year. They took his phones, multiple devices, encrypted phones, burner phones, regular mobiles, each one a potential treasure trove of evidence. And then there was the watch, the Richard Mille RM1103, £250,000 on his wrist. Officers photographed it, catalogued it, seized it. It would later be retained by a liquidator to help pay an outstanding tax bill. Even Craig McKenzie's most prized possession, his ultimate status symbol, would be taken from him. The same morning, other NCA teams were hitting Wayne McKenzie's address in Liverpool. They found him with multiple hidden phones, including Encrochat devices and basic burner phones. They discovered business documents linked to a front company used for money laundering. They seized his collection of luxury designer trainers, and they arrested him. Both brothers were taken into custody. The investigation that followed would be exhaustive. Financial analysts pored over bank records, company accounts, property transactions. Digital forensics experts extracted and analyzed data from seized phones. Intelligence officers liaised with law enforcement in Spain, the Netherlands, the UAE, building the international picture, and slowly, the full scale of the operation became clear. This wasn't just street-level drug dealing. This was commercial-scale importation and distribution with international supply chains, sophisticated money laundering, and connections to serious organized crime groups across multiple countries. The McKenzie brothers were charged with multiple offenses. Craig faced charges of conspiring to supply Class A drugs, cocaine and heroin, and Class B drugs, cannabis. He faced money laundering charges. Wayne faced similar charges, plus conspiracy to import firearms. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Craig McKenzie's trial began in 2023. His defense team had an impossible task. How do you defend against 11,000 intercepted messages that clearly show your client coordinating large-scale drug trafficking? How do you explain away the luxury lifestyle funded by a declared income of £33,000? How do you counter financial evidence showing hundreds of thousands of pounds laundered through shell companies? McKenzie tried. He'd beaten a murder charge in 2011 by convincing a jury he was just a car dealer, but this time was different. This time, the evidence wasn't circumstantial. It wasn't witness testimony that could be questioned. It was his own words, in his own messages, discussing his own crimes in explicit detail. In October 2023, Craig McKenzie was convicted. The jury found him guilty of conspiring to supply 45 kilograms of cocaine and 14 kilograms of heroin with a combined street value of £5 million, guilty of conspiring to supply 90 kilograms of cannabis worth £900,000, guilty of money laundering. The sentencing hearing would determine his fate, and the judge did not hold back. Craig McKenzie was sentenced to 20 years in prison. 20 years. He'd be in his 60s before he saw freedom again. The judge noted his extensive criminal history, his arrogance in naming his business Teflon Holdings, and the massive scale of his drug operation. This was a man who'd shown no remorse, no acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused, no indication he'd ever stop if given the chance. Wayne McKenzie's trial came in February 2024. He faced additional firearms charges on top of the drug conspiracies. The messages revealed his involvement in gun smuggling, including that chilling comment about selling a weapon straight to kids in London. And he'd committed all these offenses while on license for a previous drug trafficking conviction. Wayne was sentenced to 30 years. 30 years. A decade longer than his younger brother. The combination of large-scale drug trafficking, firearms importation, and offending while on license meant the judge had no choice but to impose a sentence that would keep Wayne McKenzie off the streets for most of his remaining years. The Teflon brothers had fallen.